Recently, the New York Times published a piece by journalist Jesse Singal with a title that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago: Medical Associations Trusted Belief Over Science on Youth Gender Care. Let that land for a moment. This isn't a conservative outlet. This isn't a religious publication. This is the New York Times, running an op-ed that essentially says the most respected medical institutions in the country substituted ideology for evidence on one of the most consequential medical questions affecting children. I want to talk about what Singal found, but more than that, I want to talk about what it means. Because this story isn't just about gender medicine. It's about something I've been tracking in my book, Fake ID, the journey from a post-truth culture to a post-trust culture. And this op-ed is a case study in how that journey works. Let's start with what Singal uncovered about how the so-called consensus was constructed. For years, advocacy groups like GLAAD and the Human Rights Campaign pointed to the professional medical organizations as proof that the science on youth gender care was settled. As GLAAD put it on its website, every major medical association supports healthcare for transgender people and youth as safe and life-saving. Case closed. The Cass Review, the most rigorous independent inquiry into youth gender medicine ever conducted, found something alarming underneath that supposed consensus. Researchers at the University of York discovered that these guidelines weren't linked to careful, independent evaluations of the evidence. Instead, they relied heavily on other organizations' guidelines. As the researchers put it, this circular referencing may explain why there has until recently been an apparent consensus on key areas of practice for which evidence remains lacking. Think about what that means. Organization A cites Organization B, and then B cites C, and C cites A. And then an advocacy group points to all three and says, see, everyone agrees. But no one independently checked the evidence. The consensus was an echo chamber dressed up in a lab coat. Singal digs into the specifics, and they're striking. Take the American Academy of Pediatrics. Their 2018 policy statement, the one cited in news reports and court documents for years, was scored by the Cass Review's researchers 12 out of 100 on rigor of development, 6 out of 100 on applicability. This is the document that was treated as the gold standard of settled science. That same document argued that children who say they are trans know their gender as clearly and as consistently as their developmentally equivalent peers. It cited a single study for that claim. It also instructed clinicians to take 4- and 5-year-olds' claims about their gender identities as certainly true, and criticized any approach that held those claims as possibly true until the child was older. Singal's reporting, and the reporting of journalist Aaron Sibarium, strongly suggests that a small group of AAP members, many of whom were themselves youth gender medicine providers, played a disproportionate role in developing these guidelines. When veteran members pushed back, they were stonewalled. One pediatrician told Singal that she left the AAP after nearly 35 years because they simply stopped answering questions. This is how a post-truth culture operates. The facts don't go away, they get managed. Inconvenient evidence gets suppressed. Dissenting voices get marginalized. And the institutions that are supposed to be the guardrails of truth become the vehicles for ideology. The story turns from troubling to genuinely alarming when you look at what these institutions did next. Because this is where the shift from post-truth to post-trust becomes undeniable. Singal highlights the American Psychological Association as the most striking example. In 2024, the APA published what it called a groundbreaking policy supporting gender-affirming care. That document criticized those who characterized gender dysphoria as a manifestation of traumatic stress or neurodivergence. It argued there was a comprehensive body of psychological and medical research supporting the positive impact of gender-affirming treatments across the lifespan. Then came 2025, a new president, a different political environment, and the APA wrote a letter to the Federal Trade Commission that straightforwardly contradicted its own 2024 document. In 2025, the APA cautioned that gender dysphoria diagnoses could be the result of trauma-related presentations rather than a trans identity. It noted that conditions like depression, anxiety, and autism may complicate or be mistaken for gender dysphoria. And it stated that psychologists do not make broad claims about treatment effectiveness. The 2025 APA published what the 2024 APA had called misinformation. And when Singal asked about the contradiction, the APA's chief advocacy officer said both documents were consistent. They are, of course, nothing of the sort. The same pattern appeared with the American Medical Association. In 2021, the AMA wrote that foregoing gender-affirming care can have tragic consequences for pediatric patients. By February 2026, the AMA agreed that surgeries on minors should be generally deferred to adulthood. That's not a minor update, that's a reversal, one that coincided with a $2 million medical malpractice verdict, not with any new scientific discoveries. Singel's honest conclusion deserves quoting. He says, "You cannot automatically trust what these organizations say at a given moment, not unless they provide a lot more information about their decision-making processes." Now, Singel approaches this from a secular left-of-center perspective. He admitted that. He's been covering this controversy for about a decade, and he notes something that should stop all of us in our tracks. Anyone who questions these treatments, even mildly, is invariably accused of bigotry. He says it would be shocking if the professional organizations weighing in on these issues were immune from that same pressure. And now that the political winds have shifted, some of them are realizing they'd benefit from appearing a bit more moderate. Singel is concerned about institutional transparency and scientific rigor, and those concerns are valid and important. What we're witnessing, though, goes deeper than the transparency problem. What we're witnessing is the natural consequence of a culture that decided feelings matter more than facts, and then handed that philosophy to its institutions. In Fake ID, I traced how our culture has moved from post-truth to post-trust. Post-truth doesn't deny that objective truth exists. It just subordinates truth to feelings. My truth, your truth. And when feelings become the arbiter of reality, the institutions that are supposed to anchor us to evidence become untethered themselves. The Pew Research Center reported that a majority of Americans under 30 believe that other people cannot be trusted and are self-seeking and exploitative. They've lost confidence not just in individuals, but in the institutions people run, the military, police, religious institutions, businesses, and yes, the scientific establishment. Can you blame them? When the AAP tells clinicians to treat a 4-year-old's gender claim as certainly true based on a single study, when the APA contradicts itself within 18 months and calls it consistent, when WPATH tries to interfere with Johns Hopkins University's independent review, when 6 UK gender clinics withhold data from the CAS review, is it any wonder that trust has evaporated? Oprah Winfrey, of all people, captured this perfectly. After looking into the downsides of AI, for example, and information manipulation, she said she developed a suspicion muscle, and then she added something haunting. There's no peace in suspicion. She's right. There is no peace in it. But suspicion is the inevitable harvest of a culture that planted post-truth seeds in its most trusted institutions. The collapse of trust doesn't just make people skeptical, it makes them cynical. And cynicism doesn't lead to better discernment. It leads to believing nothing or believing anything. As I write in Fake ID, post-truth is the modern equivalent of the boy who cried wolf. It births cynicism of all truth claims and builds playgrounds for bad actors. We're watching this happen in real time. On one side, you have institutions that spent years saying, trust the science, while not actually following the science. On the other side, you have an administration and cultural figures pushing scientifically baseless positions on vaccines and other issues. Singel himself notes the irony. At the very moment when Americans most needed trustworthy expert institutions to counter the rise of what he calls YouTube quacks, those institutions have spent their credibility on ideology. The institutions that were supposed to be the adults in the room turned out to be just as captured by cultural pressure as everyone else. And the kids, the actual children, were caught in between. So, where does that leave us? If you can't trust the institutions, and you can't trust the counter-institutions, who do you trust? The biblical framework offers something that neither side of our cultural divide can provide. The answer to a post-trust world isn't better institutions, though we need those. The answer isn't more skepticism, though healthy discernment does matter. The answer is anchoring our understanding of truth and human dignity in something that doesn't shift with political winds. The Bible says we are made in the image of God, the Imago Dei. The truth doesn't depend on an organization's policy statement. It doesn't get revised when a new administration takes office. It doesn't score 12 out of 100 on rigor because it wasn't subjected to the rigor in the first place. It's the foundation upon which rigorous inquiry becomes possible. When we know that every human being, including every confused, hurting teenager, bears the image of God, we have a reason to pursue truth and compassion simultaneously. We have a reason to say, these children deserve better than ideology from the left or dismissiveness from the right. They deserve to be seen as persons, not as arguments in a culture war. The medical institutions failed these kids not because science is broken, but because the people running the institutions subordinated truth to an agenda. In other words, the people are broken. And the antidote to that failure isn't to abandon expertise altogether. It's to anchor expertise to something higher than politics. Jesse Singal ends his piece with a carefully worded conclusion. He writes, should we trust the science? Sure, in theory, but only when the science in question has earned our trust through transparency and rigor. I'd add one thing. Transparency and rigor are essential, but they're not self-generating. They require a commitment to truth that transcends the political moment. They require the kind of intellectual honesty that says, even when the evidence doesn't support what I want to be true, I will follow it because truth matters more than my agenda. That commitment has to come from somewhere, and the history of the last several years suggests it won't come from the institutions that define themselves by their influence. It has to come from a deeper conviction about what human beings are and what they deserve. We moved from post-truth to post-trust because we convinced ourselves that reality is negotiable. The antidote isn't suspicion, it's re-anchoring ourselves to the truth that reality has a maker, and that maker doesn't shift with the polls. That's the argument I make in Fake ID, how AI and identity ideology are collapsing reality and what to do about it. If this conversation matters to you, I'd love for you to read it and join the discussion more. Thanks again.